Model the Way, the first of Kouzes and Posner's 5 practices of exemplary leadership, outlines 2 essential commitments for leaders. First is clarifying values, and second is setting the example. The first of these commitments, clarifying values, sets out a process of A, developing a deep understanding of personal values, and B, working with others to create shared values. When understanding one's own values, Kouzes and Posner suggest that a leader must find his or her own voice through an exploration of the inner self, allow the values that are found through this exploration to guide actions, and ensure that the articulation of these values is authentic. Kouzes and Posner define values as setting, quote, the parameters for the hundreds of decisions you make every day, consciously and subconsciously. They serve as guides to actions, end quote, page 49. The question this raises is how might we engage in a process of understanding the values that guide our actions? Kouzes and Posner suggest that this requires an exploration of your inner self. They state that, quote, you need to discover what you care about, what defines you, and what makes you who you are, end quote, page 46. However, they do not outline a means for engaging in this process of self-discovery. If values are the driving force behind actions, then this process of self-discovery must go beyond simply asking questions such as, what is important to me, or what do I value? This process must include an honest examination and analysis of one's past actions and decisions to determine the underlying values by which one has lived. This process of self-discovery can be challenging and painful. Our values are shaped by our family, peers, education, experiences, culture, and religion. Thus, an examination of the inner voice and values that we uphold requires investigating in depth the aspects that have combined to create these values. Ultimately, this journey requires us to recognize and accept the potential conflict between our value beliefs and actions. This self-reflective act is in essence a stripping bare of the self. If we fail to see the complexity of this descent into the inner self, we risk establishing values that are hollow, values we can speak to but which are not essential fibers of our very existence and behavior. This raises the questions: how can a leader prepare him or herself for this journey of self-discovery? What skills are necessary on this journey? Is one ready for the consequences of this self-discovery? Furthermore, when considering leadership within the field of education, the values a leader upholds must in some way be aligned with the values espoused in the field. Thus, a leader must balance the personal values discovered in their exploration of the inner self with the values implicit in government policy and professional organizations such as the Ontario College of Teachers or the Ontario Principals Council. While the discovery of values must be an inward journey, according to Kouzes and Posner, within the education field, this discovery cannot neglect the values embedded within the system itself. Thus, an educational leader must balance personal values with system values prior to engaging in a process of affirming shared values. The next step to clarifying values is to engage in a dialogue with organizational stakeholders and come to a set of common values. Quote, uncovering, reinforcing, and holding one another accountable to what we value, end quote, page 58. This collective process requires respect and appreciation for differences, a willingness to dialogue and collaborate, active listening, and the ability to engage in conflict resolution. The implications of this aspect of clarifying values are threefold. First, if affirming shared values requires a leader to engage in the process outlined above, then the assumption is that leaders all have the requisite abilities to collaborate, actively listen, and resolve conflicts. This is not necessarily reflected in practice, as many leaders do not have these skill sets. Second, if stakeholders in an organization are to dialogue about their values, the assumption is that, much like the leader, they have engaged in a complex process of self-discovery, which is not necessarily the case. Furthermore, not all stakeholders may be in a position to engage in this form of self-discovery. Thus, they may feel like outcasts in the process of identifying shared values. Third, since the process of dialoguing about values can make stakeholders feel highly vulnerable, the conditions in which this dialogue takes place is of paramount importance. Trust, openness, and risk-taking must be essential aspects of the organization for genuine value sharing to occur. The questions that must be considered when engaging in affirming shared values are: how might stakeholders be encouraged to engage in a process of self-discovery, considering the varying degrees of self-knowledge amongst stakeholders? How might a leader recognize those who may feel vulnerable with this process? What can be done to deal with this vulnerability? How can trust, openness, and risk-taking be embedded within a culture so as to allow for the possibility of genuine value sharing? And what can be done if and or when individuals refuse to engage in this process? Ultimately, a discussion about shared values must include behaviors that exude those values. This requirement is delineated in the second commitment, setting the example.